Articulating paper marks are lying to you. Now just think about it for a second, right? When you stick some articulating paper in and you get the patient to bite together, you often get false positives. So you get these red or blue marks in areas where the teeth aren't actually touching. And you also get false negatives, areas of teeth which are actually touching and you don't see a mark. And I'll tell you in my protrusive pearl later on how to overcome that when it comes to ceramic. Glazed ceramic sometimes doesn't pick up the articulator paper ink, and therefore I'll share with you a little tip on how to make it appear. But before we get to that, I just want to just elaborate on this point a little bit. When we see articulating paper marks, we see small dots, we see big dots, we kind of have different beliefs. If you ask different dentists, some will say, oh, it's the bigger marks, that means that there's more force. Whereas other people think, no, it's the smaller marks because pressure is force over area. Therefore, a smaller mark often means higher pressure. The reality of it is that this has been studied and we cannot tell by looking at articulating paper marks which ones are higher force or low force, and we definitely cannot tell which teeth are hitting first before they eventually more or less come together. We don't know anything about the timing of those contacts, which is what this episode is all about. Hello, Protruserati, I'm Jazz Galati. Now let me elaborate on that a little bit more still. When we're dealing with single tooth dentistry, this really isn't so important because you're just working on one tooth, and how important is that one tooth likely to be in the grand scheme of the entire occlusion of the patient? In most patients, you can get away with a lot. Our patients are great at adapting. But when you have an arch of temporaries or multiple units, let's say 5 or 6 units, and you want to be able to make sure that the patient's occlusion is comfortable and that no one restoration is taking too much load, we're relying on this articulating paper ink. But you don't know where to adjust, and eventually what could happen is that you end up just adjusting away all the blue dots until you don't have any contact anymore. So this is why I think there's a huge benefit of something called a tech scan or a T-scan. And I had huge reservations about this. And when I met Dr. Rob Kerstein, who's the guest on today, he's from the USA. He's done so much research. He is the go-to guy when it comes to anything to do with the tech scan. We shared a very intimate study club together. It was 3 delegates and Dr. Rob Kerstein. For a whole day, we were talking and geeking out about occlusion. So you can tell I was absolutely in my elements. And you know what? I was heckling Dr. Rob Kerstein a lot. We'll talk about that a bit. I was disagreeing with him. I was arguing with him. In good nature, we were debating, okay? And I think it's important to debate, You shouldn't take everything that you hear at face value. You should argue and debate. And so we did that, and I had a great time. And I went away thinking that, okay, to be able to measure the force and time has some value in many situations. When it comes to bigger cases, it is, for me, now that I have a T-scan, and the reason why this episode is coming out so late since I recorded it is because I was waiting for my T-scan to be delivered, and now I've used it on some patients, and I am really loving it. So we'll talk all about that journey. In fact, I'm going to do a whole occlusal adjustment episode just to elaborate on my experiences as a beginner using the T-scan and what cool and fascinating anatomical things I found by using it. But I don't want to distract from the meat of the episode today, which is with Rob Kerstein, all about how articulating paper marks are lying to us and the role of being able to measure the force and time and the benefit that gives to us and our patients. Before I met Dr. Rob Kerstein in Brighton, I had heard of the tech scan, but I'd never actually seen it in the flesh. And I got to see it, and if you haven't seen it before, it's like articulating paper. It's like a horseshoe shape, but it's completely digital. It looks like a little paper version of a circuit board. And what the amazing benefit of it is that when you put it in the patient's mouth, you get the bite together, it transmits all this data to the computer, and you can see which tooth hits first, what is the sequence of the tooth contacts and which teeth are hitting early and which teeth are hitting late, how much force is being distributed across the arch. Now, think of it already like with implants, right? For example, when we're working with traditional articulating paper, we're trying to make sure that we can get some degree of clearance on single implants, right? We don't want our implants to hold shim stock foil. We want a little bit of clearance. Now, ask different dentists, they'll tell you different microns of amount, but now you can actually quantify that and verify that digitally using something like a T-scan. So many numerous benefits, and we'll talk all about them. But the thing that took me by surprise is that there's actually so much evidence when it comes to CT scan. Like, we know that in the field of occlusion in general, the long-term studies, follow-ups, conclusions are poor quality overall. But then Dr. Rob Kerstein opened my eyes to all this evidence base. He shared this Google Drive folder with me with so many PDFs looking at the different trials and studies that have happened with the different evolutions of T-scan, and some of it was just really eye-opening. So if you want to geek out with that, he's given permission for me to share these PDFs with you all. All you have to do is go to protrusive.co.uk/evidence. That's protrusive.co.uk/evidence, and I'll give you access to every one of these PDFs. So if you want to just geek out or learn further or critique the evidence, we should always critique the evidence when it's available. Check that out. My experiences so far with the T-scan have been pretty cool, and I can't wait to share that with you in the extra episode, like I said. But I take great comfort in knowing that great dentists like Dr. Bobby Supple from the US and Dr. Riaz Yar, UK's very own Professor Riaz Yar, is also using it. In fact, he's sharing on his Instagram story pretty much every day different T-scan case, and it's just great to know that I'm in good company when it comes to that. Actually, acquiring a T-scan was a tough thing to do as an associate, right? I'm not the owner of the clinic, I'm just an associate. Therefore, it was something that I had to have a real in-depth conversation with my principals, because ultimately I was going to be the only one that's going to be using it. So I felt bad that my principals were going to have to pull out their credit card and buy something that's just for me. So I sort of struck a deal with my principals. I said, as an associate, I'll pay for it, but let's work out a little business deal. So if you want to hear about my business deal, I'll talk about that in the outro. I don't want to distract from the main episode any further. So if you listen to the outro, I'll tell you about the conversations I had with my principals and how the T-scan has some degree of an ROI. It has a return on investment. Now, in episode 4, all the way back when, in episode 4, I did discuss with Dr. Neil Jaiswal about microscopes and how microscopes, something that you buy because you want to improve your dentistry, it doesn't really have an ROI. Like, you can't charge X amount for your root canal treatment and then you can't charge an extra subsidy for the microscope. It just doesn't work. But with the T-scan, I'm able to actually do that. And patients do realize a wow factor when it comes to this. So I'll talk about how the business arrangement works if you listen in the outro. The protrusive dental pearl I have is about articulating paper. Now you're thinking, Jazz, you're talking about the T-scan, which is supposed to replace your articulating paper because it's like the new age thing, and now you're going to give us a tip about articulating paper? How does that work? Well, actually, when you use the T-scan, you interpret the data, but you still need the ink from the articulating paper, because that's all the articulating paper does. It transfers ink from the contacts. It doesn't tell you the true contacts always, and it doesn't tell you about force and time. So, but you want to know about the ink points. So when you're interpreting that T-scan data, you're marrying it up with the articulating paper mark. So they're still important, and there's still a role of the articulating paper ink. Now, sometimes you might realize that no matter how much you get the patient to occlude together, the ink is not rubbing off on the teeth. And quite classically, a glazed ceramic will be difficult to actually have the articulating paper mark show up. So the little hack for you is to get a tiny smear of Vaseline. Please, please, please put a sparing amount of Vaseline, like on a microbrush, for example, and then you paint that microbrush on the articulating paper. Now, obviously, articulating papers are all different. This works on AccuFilm, which is the one I use, and then you paint both sides of it, and you get the patient to bite together, and there we are. Before, you could not see the ink mark, and now you will be able to, because the Vaseline has an effect on the articulating paper, which allows it to stain or ink the teeth more effectively. So that this really works, and it helps you in those scenarios where you just want to see where exactly the contact is on your ceramic restoration. So I hope you enjoyed this main podcast. Open your mind, guys. Open your mind. I know we've been taught a specific way, and like I said, I was the biggest heckler Rob Kerstein ever had, but I think there's a beauty in listening to different people's opinions, and let's give our warm, protrusive welcome to Dr. Rob Kerstein and listen to what he has to say, because I definitely have found so much value from it, and I hope you will too. I'll see you in the outro, where we'll talk about my business deal with my principals. Robert Kerstein, welcome to the Protrusive Dental Podcast. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thank you for asking. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. Obviously, it was great to see you at the Tubules Congress. I was one of the guys at your lectures, and when I emailed you, I said, hey, I was the annoying guy who kept asking silly questions and stuff, and we were having, it was good fun. It wasn't many of us, but that made for a very intimate discussion, and I got to have a lot of one-to-one with you, and we exchanged philosophies and debates, and I felt as though with Occlusion, it was really good and important that we kept it still with mutual respect, because we see all the time different occlusal camps, right? They're at each other's others' throats, but my mindset is very much like, okay, I want to hear your perspective. Now, I might not agree with everything you had to say, Rob, and definitely you wouldn't agree with some of the things that I believe, but I think what this podcast is about, what Protrusive is about, is bringing these different occlusal philosophies together and just sharing with one another. So that's why I'm so grateful for you to join me today. You obviously had your UK tour. Now, for those of you who don't know who you are, Rob, please tell us a little bit about yourself, where you practice. Obviously, you're a prosthodontist, how you got involved with the objective measurement of occlusion and how that's evolved over time.
Well, first, thank you for having me on the Protrusive podcast, and I'm honored to be here. I'm a prosthodontist, as you said, and I began my training at Tufts in 1984 when I graduated dental school. I was a dental student and went on to prosthodontics. And in my program was built the first T-scan, T-scan 1. We're now on T-scan 10. And I began using it without really any knowledge other than, it was something that you could measure time and force. And although it had a manual, it wasn't really understood how you would use its data. And for example, how would you make a better denture with it? How would you deliver a crown and bridge case with it? How could you diagnose someone's occlusion with it? But it had some very interesting features, mostly the timing aspect. You could measure timing and you could measure force levels. And when you use that information to make intelligent choices about what to adjust or to treat, patients responded much faster than when it wasn't used. And as a prosthodontic resident, I was delivering different size temporaries. I was delivering different crown and bridge cases. We were at the beginning of implants, so that wasn't really part of my program other than the introduction to implant dentistry. 1983 was when Brandemark wrote his important paper about how to do osseointegration. So I was 1984, and the T-scan was built then, and it was transferred to 16 dental institutions in the United States, all prominent prosthodontic programs. And I was the only person who really took to it in a sort of a studying it scientific way. And I saw things with it that you couldn't see without it. And certainly you couldn't see with traditional occlusal indicators like carbon paper, for example, or silicone imprints or mounted models, because it was dynamic. You had this time element. So I began studying it with my professor who built it. My professor, William Mannis, he built the program T-scan 1 with 5 engineers from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I was the first real researcher with it, which was led to me becoming more and more involved with it over time. And I've been part of every iteration in some way from T-scan 1 all the way up to today's version of T-scan 10. And I should say, in full disclosure, I am a consultant for the TechScan Corporation, but I do not receive compensation for sales of any TechScan product. I'm strictly education, research, and training. And I've been an advocate, of course, because I've seen how powerful it is compared to what traditional occlusion offers. And the T-scan has found solutions for many problems that dentists face routinely that traditional occlusion has not found answers for. So that's really how I got into it. Now, 38 years later, I've published hundreds of articles about it, most of it research and hard science, some commentary, but most of it is hard science and research on timing and excursive function and how that influences the neurophysiology of the human stomatognathic system. I've been fortunate enough to collaborate with many experts around the world to publish 5 volumes on digital measured occlusion. That really is an incredible compilation of all that we've discovered with using digital occlusion compared to using traditional occlusion. And it's a major advance for the patient to have digital occlusion be performed on them. So, my whole life has really been tied up in the T-scan, although I didn't start out that way. I was going to be a prosthodontist who crowned lots of teeth and made beautiful smiles, and I did that. But I used the T-scan to help me do that, and that was a huge advantage through my years of clinical practice. And now I don't practice anymore other than to do live demonstrations and to treat patients in seminars. But I collaborate with many researchers throughout the world and continue to publish, lecture, and train dentists in how to properly use the technology.
Well, I think the best place to start would be some people who are listening who may not have heard about the TEC scan or T-scan, and maybe if you can just roll it back a little bit, what is the alternative that we've been trained to use at dental school and we use all the time? And I think you made a great point of the fallacies or the fallbacks or the problems with using articulating foil or articulating paper. So if you just explain to dentists, what is the traditional way and what are the disadvantages of relying on articulating paper marks in terms of the quote-unquote the way to measure the occlusion, and what does the T-scan offer above and beyond these paper marks?
Well, it's a very good question. First, the traditional method is very important because it marks the teeth if you're going to specifically talk about articulating paper. But that's its true use. It's not really designed to measure the occlusion, and although dentistry has given it those attributes by sort of describing size as a way to choose force, or color depth, or distribution, lots of marks that look like they're everywhere means you have a balanced bite, and actually research shows none of that is actually true. For example, large paper marks are only forceful 14 to 21% of the time. So if someone always picks the largest mark as the highest force, they're going to be incorrect 86% of the time, and studies actually bear that information out. So the research on both articulating paper as a medium to detect force actually is very, very strong in that it can't be done at all, right? And if you asked an engineer, it's very simple actually, if you asked an engineer, can you measure bite force with carbon paper and ink marks, and they would say, no, it doesn't measure anything, it's just ink. Because of a lack of measurement tools prior to the computer era, used these analog materials like wax and silicone imprints and articulating paper markings to try to determine what was going on with the occlusion. But all the mediums really do is detect size of contact, not the type of contact quality, not the timing of it, not the force. And research, again, bears this all out. There was recently a published systematic review that looked at all the literature on valid studies that show whether articulating paper, for example, can measure force. And there are only 20 papers in the entire continuum of dental literature on articulating paper's capabilities, and none of them show it can measure anything at all, occlusal. So, as I said, dentistry has given it this credibility that it should be used to detect force, and it can't do it at all. Alternatively, the T-scan does measure force, time, and pressure by capturing the electronic displacement of applied pressure to the teeth as it spreads out over the teeth. You know, when you bang your hands together, it's like banging teeth together. The force spreads out, across your hand, depending on how you impact and what angle of attack you have. That's what the T-scan measures. So as the teeth approximate each other, grind over each other, clench together, gnash together, the T-scan can capture those interactions of the resultant force across a time continuum. And that allows one to make very intelligent decisions about what aspects of the occlusion there's too much force in, there's too little force in, which side hits too early, which side hits too late. You may remember in our seminar, our patient demonstration, the dentist that we measured, his right side always hit before his left side.
Shout out to Ian Kerr, top guy, funny guy. So yeah, what we did with at the Congress is we used Ian as an example. We used the T-scan on him, and yeah, you're right. It was always the right side in terms of timing that was shooting up to his maximum pressure. Now, just to continue this theme, the reason why I'm on board, and the reason I purchased, and the reason why I brought you on today is because I think there's a huge role in terms of spreading the knowledge about the benefits of measuring the occlusion, which this podcast will evolve. But a lot of people listening right now or watching will be thinking, well, I've been using articulating paper all these years, and I also I'm using sound. Some dentists like, which is fine. Okay, you're getting some of that. You're using your fingers to check for PDL movement. But what did it for me, what the benefit I find is that it's a tool that's going to make things more efficient, more accurate, and especially in the era of implants, and we're trying to be careful to move forces away from implants. I see it as a huge tool that will ultimately save me time in terms of adjustments. Like just today, I did some resin build-ups, upper 3 to 3, lower 3 to 3, and I was relying on carbon paper markings. And if I just had the tech scan, because I've ordered it, I'm waiting for it now, it would just give me a quick reference to adjust it. However, some dentists are concerned about the tech scan that, hey, why are we even adjusting these occlusions in the first place? Like, why are these timing issues even a problem? Because what most dentists will argue is that the literature supports that occlusal adjustment doesn't help TMD. Now, the literature is poor, and I think you'll agree with that, Robert. The literature that's done that poo-poos occlusal equilibration stuff, and we'll come to that, isn't great literature in the first place. But a lot of dentists have this concern that the T-scan is this tool that's an encourage dentists to start grinding away contacts, whereas actually, had they continued their life without that occlusal adjustment, they may have been just fine. So how can we speak to that cohort of dentists?
Well, those dentists that don't measure the occlusion use a lot of subjectivity to make occlusal assessments, like you mentioned, sound and feel. None of that quantifies the actual occlusion in any measurable way that allows you to make, again, intelligent decisions about what to treat. And this is not necessarily related to solely making occlusal adjustments on natural teeth. You just said you did 6 composite buildups, or 3 and 3 against each other. Delivering that can become a real problem for an office if they choose the wrong contacts because they chose the paper marks that they thought were the ones they should treat, but actually they left a lot of bad contacts in place, or they removed good ones thinking they were removing bad ones. And so the value of measuring for any clinician is their choice to use the T-scan to treat occlusally, but certainly in the restorative realm, in the implant realm, in the prosthodontic realm, not guessing at paper marks which don't measure force is a huge advantage for any treating practitioner. And just what you mentioned, that it would speed up your end result. Yes, it would actually guide your end result. It would allow you to make, again, intelligent choices as to what to remove after you did your buildups. And that principle applies to whether you're delivering a denture, whether you're delivering a fancy implant prosthesis, whether you're adjusting a natural dentition because the patient has TMD symptoms, whether you have, occlusal issues that keep showing up after you've done a quadrant of fillings and the patient keeps coming back saying it doesn't feel right. These are all things that plague a dental practice. I've given seminars, courses, and live demonstrations all over the world, and I always, 100% of the time, receive patients in these demonstrations that have had dentistry done that they aren't comfortable with, and they're not able to get comfortable with sometimes months or years of follow-up of traditional occlusion attempts to manage their case. And what's fascinating is the patients are amazed that I can actually measure their bite and fix what's wrong in front of a group of people, not ever knowing them. I didn't have any predetermination of what their situation was. In other words, I didn't choose them. They were chosen for me. And I was able to, many times, in just that short appointment that was in a live demonstration, resolve their problem for them because I was able to measure. So that translates into, if you have a T-scan at delivery, you measure the outcome, you improve the outcome with intelligence and knowledge as to what contacts to treat, as opposed to subjectively trying to decide which ones to treat. And the patient saying, I think it's high over here, or I think it's high over there. All of that is eliminated by having the T-scan to give you the incorrect forces where they're located on the teeth, to show you where there's too much pressure in your new restoration. And then you adjust accordingly, and that speeds up the treatment for both you and the patient. And, just to follow on that thought, not to overplay this, but the idea of having complications after dentistry, that's something that came to see me in my office through my 36 years of practice. All more than any other thing that sought me out were patients who were uncomfortable with the dentistry they received. And patients came from all over the world to have a T-scan evaluation. And again, many of them left in 1 or 2 visits with a markedly improved situation. That really the only difference between me and the treating practitioner was I had the information about force, time, and pressure, that the that the dentist who made the teeth, the fillings, the crowns, whatever it was that had set this patient off, and it wasn't full mouth rehabilitation. It was quadrants of fillings, a few crowns together, orthodontic end result, a tooth was extracted and their bite changed. These things were all manageable at the moment they occurred if you have knowledge of force, time, and pressure. So the dentists who say, well, the T-scan is encouraging us to adjust, there's so much adjusting going on in dentistry. Every dentist adjusts things every day. And imagine if you could control, so many more of your outcomes that, you didn't have the guesswork of subjectivity that traditional occlusion brings to your day-to-day practice. It would save you so much time.
Mm-hmm. But Robert, these patients that were finding their way to you on these courses, which were you didn't pick them, they just came and they had a problem and you were solving it. Do you think there could be an element of the fact that the same dentist who treated that patient initially, who now had a bite that wasn't happy for whatever reason, that same dentist who's also treating many other patients, those other patients maybe had a wider scope of adaptation or a adaptive capacity. And then there are a certain group of patients, everyone's adaptive capacity might be different, and some people's bites just may be more sensitive than others. And because of that difference, this cohort of patients treated by that same dentist didn't feel the comfort that the other patients usually do. Do you think there's any merit in that? Is there any research behind that?
Well, I can't speak to if there's research behind that, but what you're talking about is called, is really the central nervous system's ability to modulate the occlusal neurologic output that comes from the teeth. And the challenge for any dentist is we don't know the adaptive capacity of each person, even though they might sound nice in the chair before we start working with them. 10 visits later, after they're still complaining about their bite, we didn't know that person was let's say, more sensitive than someone else. So the reality of using the T-scan, it allows you to get high precision outcomes with every patient. And therefore you aren't, you're really in a way controlling, or I shouldn't say controlling, but you're optimizing their adaptive response to the installed occlusion. And to the other patients that you're discussing, the ones that may not have felt their bite was off or their bite was problematic, their ability to describe what's going on occlusally, although accepting it, doesn't mean that the case is good. Here's an example of that. I recently trained a dentist in a state near mine, 2 hours away, and he had a patient come in who had a fancy upper implant case done, like a fixed hybrid against natural teeth on the bottom. And he said, yeah, it feels really great. And, I'm having no trouble with it. We put him on the T-scan. He was 70% right, 30% left with all the force concentrated on 2 or 3 implants. So he wasn't able to describe the real problem. And so even though his adaptive capacity might have been high, his ability to discern quality occlusal force distribution was very poor. And then the interesting thing is when we rearranged it to be much more balanced and much less concentrated in one corner of the prosthesis, which if you put that out now 5 years, 7 years, where that corner is receiving 70% of the bite, it's going to break things, it's going to loosen implants, it's going to cause screws to come undone. It's hard to say what would happen, but there's no question with that overload that it was going to have some sequelae. So after we finished rearranging, he goes, that really is a lot better. I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting in the front corner of my mouth until after I had this pressure relieved, right? So the response of the patient is obviously a critical factor in, let's say, how fast they adapt to what we do. But it doesn't mean that the person who doesn't feel their bite or is aware of their bite isn't suffering occlusal overload in certain parts of their mouth, or isn't having gum recession on a few teeth, or isn't having wear on a few teeth because they've still tolerated their bite. It doesn't mean that they're not having an occlusal problem.
I just want to add to that, Robert, and I agree that just because the patient says it feels fine doesn't mean it's fine, because so many times in my career I've just done my restoration, I've taken the rubber dam off, I get them to bite together and say, and I just stupidly ask prematurely, how does that feel? And they say it feels great, but when you had a look, there's a huge discrepancy, which I would never accept, and I would never want to leave that patient with that huge, I'm talking like, a whole millimeter on the other side. And then only after I adjusted Oh yeah, it still feels great, but now at least I've got everything in contact and conform to the previous. So patient subjectivity is something that we shouldn't rely wholly on, which I agree with. Now, an interesting thing that you mentioned, this is deviating a little bit, but I thought it would make for an interesting discussion point, just to learn a little bit about this from you, because this was really fascinating. You mentioned about if by equilibrating someone's MIP so that you got a better balance. And I may be using the wrong terms here, Robert, so please correct me. You improve the patient's gait, and I think you might use that word or another word. But just to tell you, I was posting about the TEC scan on Instagram, and someone reached out to me on Instagram who was a patient who actually received T-scan treatment, and this is what he had to say. This is from Peter's Health Journal. And he said, I had my bite adjusted through T-scan. The effects were stunning. After alterations not visible to the eye, such weird sensations went through my body from head to toe. And it says occlusion, and this guy, he's not a dentist, he said occlusion has a big influence on the whole body. And this was after you'd mentioned about some similar things that you're on the Congress. Now, dentists naturally, we, as a collective group, dentists, we think that this is a lot of hocus pocus. But what patients tell us, it's important what they tell us. The feedback they give us is important. How many times have patients described such an effect to you, and what do you think is behind that?
Well, the first part, many patients have described peripheral improvements that they did not expect to receive from having their bite refined with the T-scan in specific ways. And it isn't only balancing the bite, it's treating the excursions and treating the excursive function. That's actually one of the most critical components to it, to obtaining high quality outcomes. But the response that you're talking about, peripheral postural response, like this person had, is due to the fact that the posterior pulpal fibers and the posterior PDL, periodontal ligament mechanoreceptors, they input noxious stimuli into the brain directly, because fibers from them go directly into the center of the brain, into the reticular formation, which is a huge brain center, sort of an amorphous middle of your cerebellum that controls breathing, respiration, digestion, posture and balance, and sexual function. And the teeth are hooked up to digestion through the swallowing mechanism and chewing and masticating. So the center of the brain receives this output from the teeth every time teeth are rubbed together, compressed, flexed, chewed upon, ground over, clenched against. Every time. It's not something the human can control. And the person who's susceptible to it has poor modulation of it in the central nervous system, which may be termed, as per our last discussion, as adaptation. But the nature of it is it's an ongoing electrical toxic influx that teeth put out, that unless the human has a resistance to it, it takes its toll in many different ways. And again, this is because of the neurology, which is not well taught and not well understood by dentistry. Occlusion is taught biomechanically. It's not taught neurologically, and yet the occlusion is an amazing neurologic trigger. It's the biggest trigger point in the head and neck that's not ever been considered a trigger point. But it constantly is throwing out electrical stimuli in order to modulate swallowing and digestion and chewing at the brain level. And so why someone would have, let's say, improved posture from having their bite adjusted with the T-scan, which is actually a very nice study that just came out on 90 patients who had dramatically improved posture after having their bite adjusted with the T-scan, is because of this pathway into the center of the brain that the posterior pulps and PDL fibers make. And it's not a synaptic entrance. It's a direct, no switch right into the center of the brain. And so then the electrical stimulus that comes from the teeth, if it's a lot, which is, again, what is the individual human's modulation of it, if it's a lot of electrical activity, which we can measure some of that with the EMG in surface muscles, but the same negative energy goes out to the center of the brain, it will influence other structures. And so people have told me that they had brain fog go away after they had their bite adjusted. They always felt like weird and unclear, and they couldn't find anything wrong with them. And they had two, MRIs of their brain and scans done of their head. And when their bite was adjusted, their brain fog lifted, right? Well, that's a similar component as to someone saying that my shoulders aligned after I had my bite adjusted, or I stopped having throat tension. Like, Very interesting thing that happens to singers is singers can sing better after they have their bite adjusted. I've treated opera singers who would say, I can't get the range I used to get, and my muscles tighten up, and it just feels like I can't be free with my singing. And then we free them of their noxious stimulus that comes from their pulps and their PDLs of the posterior teeth, and they can sing better, longer, wider, taller, deeper, higher, with less muscle strain. That's very noticeable, and it's in a short period of time. It doesn't take months to kick in. It happens within a few short weeks of improving this noxious output that the teeth make.
I mean, Robert, my Brit, and I shared this with you when we met. My British dental brain is very much like, what is this hocus pocus, right? And that might be a response that you may get. So, but I know that you said that you've got, there's T-scan data that shows this. Yeah. But when you look at the mainstream evidence on the works of Manfredini et al., who really there's a whole opposite camp. Whereas there's a camp where it says there's the high importance in terms of the correct bite, whereas there's other camps that suggest that, for example, TMD has nothing to do with occlusion. These are bold things. Even the systematic reviews, which again the studies aren't that great, are against it. So therefore, as a defensive dentist practicing in the UK, I would find it a very bold claim to make to a patient that we can improve X, Y, and Z by adjusting your bite. But I know that you have got lots of patients that you told me that you've been able to, for example, treat their TMD through occlusal adjustment, which as a profession as a whole in the UK especially, I don't know what's like in the US, but in the UK, that is frowned upon treatment, especially first line. Okay, so first line would be various other things, physiotherapy, splints, whatever, and then potentially there could be some occlusal adjustment. That is, but a dentist in the UK would have to think twice before doing that. So tell us about your experiences in treating patients with TMD through occlusal equilibration that's been guided by the T-scan, and why do you think different occlusal camps or different dent schools aren't taking this technology and using it in the way that in the way that you've seen benefit many patients?
Well, it's a two-part question. So the first part, with respect to treating TMD, equilibration is not actually what we do. That's the first thing. And
I apologize.
No, but it's important because most of the studies that looked at TMD response to occlusal adjustment actually had a form of occlusal equilibration done. And that's actually not what the T-scan guided treatment is all about. So equilibration is making CR, CO, and CO equal. And if you do that, you will lessen the CR-CO discrepancy, but you won't treat any symptoms with any predictability because positional improvements aren't a solution to TMD. That's why the schools have a hard time, not the dental schools, but the schools of philosophical thought. They believe that they find this ideal position, the symptoms will go away. And that's true with the appliance between the teeth. But once the teeth come back together again, no matter what position you're in, the neurology goes back to work. And often people that are re-occluded, let's say, after months in splints, their symptoms come right back when their ortho puts their teeth together or their prosthodontics puts their teeth together in this new so-called position. So it's actually the teeth themselves that create the symptoms through neurologic output into the brain, as I described before. And this is a component of occlusal adjustment that hasn't been addressed by the outdated studies that used occlusal equilibration. And they also, those studies, and this is important too, also those studies only treated CR-CO discrepancy and balancing inclines, but not treat working side group function contacts in those studies that people like let's say the biopsychosocial camp would say that there's no relationship between occlusion and TMD. They actually didn't treat the most important component. We've discovered through many papers now, research papers, that using EMG, that working side group function contacts cause most of the problems that dentists face when it comes to symptoms. And so those studies that a lot of people use as evidence that bite adjustment or the bite has nothing to do with TMD actually didn't treat the correct thing. And so, of course, they got no resolution. Now, we've been treating working side group function in a procedure called disclusion time reduction, which is an excursively based occlusal adjustment that's done in MIP, maximum intercuspation. It's not done in CR. There's no positioning the patient in CR. And there's no appliance phase needed before you do it in correct patients, which are patients that have high muscle firing, reasonably good occlusal relationships, both skeletally and dentally, and have no significant joint breakdown. They can pop and click, and they can have mild displacements, but they can't have bone-to-bone contact, and they can't have condylar damage, and they can't have fully displaced discs. And so that actually makes up a wide range of TMJ patients who have mostly muscular problems. That's actually 80% of the TMJ population.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, we've proved over and over and over again in studies, not, again, my word, in research environments, treating many different groups of patients at different places in the world with different practitioners using the T-scan in these specific ways to treat the disclusion time. And the results are comparable study to study, that the occlusion is the number one cause of TMD, especially muscular TMD.
Wow.
And it's because of this neurology. So the last thing I want to say is you quoted you didn't quote them, but you pointed to some systematic reviews. All the systematic reviews about
Luther 2010 is a classic one, the orthodontic community.
You won't find any T-scan studies in any of the systematic reviews. They've been purposefully left out. And I've been dealing with that since 1984. There have been many years that important T-scan studies were done about the disclusion time reduction, about treating TMD symptoms, controlled occlusal adjustment studies, treating timing, force, and pressure. And none of them have made it into these systematic reviews until recently. There's a 2021 systematic review that looked at all the different occlusal indicators and how useful they are for measuring occlusion and for treating patients. And of course, that one actually included about 90 T-scan papers. And that's the first.
Okay, brilliant.
Yes, that's the first systematic review.
I will check that one out. I mean, and I'll share that with the community, because one of the things is about this podcast is just to share as much knowledge as we can, especially in the realm of occlusion. So it's great to share these concepts. Now, one objection people might have is, but the sensor is 100 microns thick. Now, what Rain told me when she came over to the practice that is 100 meters, but when a patient bites together, it becomes 60 microns. Some dentists might suggest that, okay, because there's this 60 microns between the teeth, how is it really recording what you think we're recording, is one objection that dentists might have. But equally, in the carbon paper world, we know that we get false marks all the time. You get false positive marks all the time. So that's one thing for that. But what would you have to say to a dentist who may be concerned about trying the tech scan on their patients because they are worried about the thickness of the actual T-scan itself?
Well, the thickness has been an issue for a long time with the naysayers of the T-scan, because instead of recognizing that the sensor is a sophisticated printed electronic circuit that measures incredibly detailed occlusal dynamics that can't be measured in any other way, the fact that it's 100 microns thick and gets reduced to 67 microns is actually inconsequential because of what it does, right? It measures things you can't see in any other way. Force spread over teeth. Like I said, if I go like this, the force spreads out over my hand. I can't measure it by looking, right? But if I put a T-scan sensor in there, I would be able to see the force spread, where it went, which parts of my hand, which parts got overloaded, which parts didn't get any force, right? So the sophisticated printed electronic circuit is a incredible device. It's actually used all over the world in many applications that people don't question its thickness, because it works in such unique ways and gives such unique information. And it's used in hundreds of industries. It's just that dentistry has thought that it should be thinner. But unfortunately, the gold standard of measuring time and force is the T-scan sensor, right? Marking teeth might be carbon paper at 30 microns or 20 microns, but marking paper doesn't give force, time, and pressure information, and it doesn't allow the dentist to know any of the information that the T-scan sensor knows. So the sensor itself has to work well under compressive load, repetitive compressive
Pressure.
loads, and clenching and grinding actions, and not get destroyed. And actually, one study that was done on all the different occlusal indicators showed that the T-scan was the only occlusal indicator that could reproduce the test environment 18 out of 19 times. All other occlusal indicators, carbon paper, wax, silk ribbon, silicone, they all got destroyed after they got through 4, 5, 6, 7 uses. And of course, that's not the case with the T-scan sensor. So the thickness is a positive attribute to being able to gather this very unique and highly precise information that can't be gathered in any other way. And I think that's really just sort of like an argument that's gone by the wayside. If you want the information that the T-scan gives you, the sensor thickness is not really a concern, right? And having said that, it's well within the range of many occlusal indicators that dentists use routinely. For example, there's carbon paper that's 200 microns thick that no one complains about using, right? No one ever says it's too thick to use. Well, it's the same.
None
right?
of my listeners use that one. But yeah, please don't use 200 microns.
The point being that wax wafers are much thicker than the T-scan sensor, right?
Yeah.
And certain carbon papers are thinner, but the thinness doesn't mean that the information that the T-scan offers a clinician is negated because the sensor has a certain thickness to work well under many compressive load situations and report highly sophisticated data, right? It's like you need that thickness so it doesn't get destroyed while it's being chewed on, right? And so it works extremely well. One of the most interesting things about that argument is there are no papers written about the T-scan where the sensor perforation is a problem. Right? In other words, people don't write things that say, yeah, the sensor breaks, you can only use it 3 times, it breaks very often. And when that happens, you get corrupted data. You don't get a hole in that doesn't mark ink. You get a corrupted electronic entity. So the thickness is really an important attribute to be able to withstand the stresses of occlusion. And as I said, it's well within the range of many occlusal indicators that people don't question its thickness.
I mean, yeah, for me, it's the whole additional information that thickness gives us in terms of timing and pressure, which was, for me, the light bulb moment and why I'm excited to use this technology to help my patients. Like, we debated about this already, Robert, and, I'm not convinced yet. And look, I'm still a young dentist. I have so much to learn. The thing with me is I'm open to the fact that in 5 years' time, I might change my mind. And as long as that's led by some degree of evidence or good clinical sound experiences. So if, for example, if my patients after my T-scan adjustments in the future do come back and they stop bruxing, which is something that we spoke about, you said that, okay, there is a belief that once we get everything adjusted 50-50 or nearabouts, and we reduce the excursion disclusion time, that patients may stop bruxing. I'd like to find that out for myself through sophisticated methods and whatnot. And I was speaking to Ian. We want to hit up East Grinstead Hospital. We want to do some sleep studies is what we want to do with the EMG. That's that would be the pinnacle to prove something like that. But I'm open to it, and I want to work with the technology to grow dentistry and to grow the measuring of occlusion. So I think that's important, and I just think it's a fantastic tool the way you describe it. So there's definitely a place in it. My only qualm, and I have to ask this because I know my listeners know my thoughts on this, is that we have these people who are 20-minute chewers a day, like people who just, they don't spend much time in MIP. So I know you answered this very well when we were at the Congress, but I think everyone else needs to hear it as well, is that if we have people who are just chewing their teeth 20 minutes a day and they're not that parafunctional, for example, this group of patients, then do we really need to go to that level of precision, especially in a completely asymptomatic patient who may have an anterior open bite and they've had it for many years and they have no issues and stuff, and they're only 20-minute chewers and they're not having any signs of occlusal disease? Is it overkill to have this level of precision? Is it really necessary?
Well, it's a very good question. It's certainly not overkill to be able to adequately diagnose anyone's occlusion to a high level of precision. It's more beneficial to both the patient and to the clinician. But what you're asking about is, why is it that, if the teeth are only used for 20 minutes, is this occlusion such an important issue? And it's because people swallow 1,000 times a day. And in order to swallow, you have to put your teeth together. And swallowing is what actually creates the hyperfunction of the musculature, because it has to go on. It's a central nervous system mediated response that we have no control over, to lubricate your throat, to protect your airway from swallowing food, to ensure that you're able to eat and chew and digest and fuel your body. So swallowing makes up a huge amount of time that people put their teeth together unknowingly. And just to point out about the 20-minute study, Most people don't know about that study. That study was done with a 3-unit bridge, which is only 3 teeth in the mouth, right? That's not all 32 teeth being used, right? So that's
I thought it was done by Complete Dentures, a graph, 1969, I think. But I mean, yeah,
but,
it's
you know,
a difficult study to get hold of, I'll tell you that.
Right, and again, doing it with Complete Dentures, if it's a different study than the 3-unit bridge study, which was an 18-minute study, meaning that the bridge was functioned for 18 minutes, you're not able to, with a denture, even in any way replicate the human function. So it's not even a comparable. It's not even a comparable environment to be able to test how many times a day someone put their teeth together. But the overriding element, to answer the question as I did in the seminar that you were at with me, is that the swallowing mechanism puts teeth together thousands of times a day. And those compressions and flexions of the pulp stimulate muscle activity that tire out the patient. And that's where TMJ comes from. It's when the swallow mechanism is actually backfiring. And then the person can't chew well because their muscles have been contracted too many times to swallow for years. And now their jaw doesn't chew well, or they get headaches because they've been contracted. The temples have been contracting to swallow thousands of times a day, and they build up lactic acid, and then the person goes and uses their teeth, and then they get a migraine, right? It's all tied into the central nervous system and the swallow mechanism that the person can't control. So these timing of teeth studies they're not comparable to what really goes on in the human condition. And as a result, it's not an environment that can really test out how someone might respond to their occlusion. So the second part of the question is, do we need this kind of precision? The challenge for any dentist is that we don't know how well the patient will adapt to what we give them. Mm-hmm. And so there's that element, and then there's the breakage, fracture, and dislodgement element. We make them something nice, and then 6 months later, there's a chunk of it missing that shouldn't be missing because it's brand new, but it's missing because the occlusal forces weren't managed. So everyone needs this kind of precision for their patients to get predictable outcomes. Measuring the bite with the T-scan and optimizing it with the T-scan data in closure and excursions. And that's important that people understand that it's not balancing the bite. Balancing the bite, people can live with a 5 to 10% imbalance in their bite much more comfortably than they can with poor excursive function, because balancing the bite is really not a generator of high muscle firing. It's chewing, eating, and moving around that causes high muscle firing. And so excursive treatment with the T-scan is very, very important, more so than balancing the bite in the natural tooth patient. But in the prosthetic patient, balancing the bite is very important to preserve the dental materials and to make sure that one side isn't taking 70% like that patient I described, right? So that the implants don't get overloaded. So the answer to your question is, who needs the precision? Every dentist needs the precision. They're fighting against the occlusal forces in their practice every day, whether they believe they are or not. The occlusal forces are at work every day in your practice. You may not be treating them, but they're there breaking teeth on the patient. They're there causing gum recession. They're there causing headaches and jaw pain. They're there breaking your new ceramic inlay that was just put in, or they're not allowing the person to adapt to the new ceramic inlay that was put in. So the nature of measuring only improves the outcomes for the dentist and the patient. And so there is no, answer that, yeah, it's okay for some. You don't really need it for everyone. You only need it for the top 10% who can't get used to what we make them. No, that's not true at all. Every dentist needs control over the occlusion. It'll save so much time if they measure that the problems dentists face tied to occlusion are more than any other aspect of their practice. There's no question about that.
Hi guys, it's Jazz again, just interfering with this helpful little nugget, which for some of you will save you a lot of money. If you are in the market for a T-scan, then I've twisted the arm of Clark Dental to give you a discount. So if you use the famous protrusive code, you will get £200 off a T-scan unit. You just need to contact Clark Dental. This is an exclusive offer for the protruserati only, because you guys are ones that are geeky and love occlusion. That's why you listen to the podcast. So if you head to clarkdentalsales.co.uk, that's Clark without an E, it's Clark Dental Sales. I'll put it in the description and the show notes so you can check it out, and you can get a £200 discount by using the code protrusive. So I hope that helps. I mean, it rings true whenever I've got a patient in temporaries, right? And I've inserted some temporaries, and I just like the idea of being guided by technology that measures the time, the pressure, to be able to adjust that and to guide that adjustment so that I am I'm being led by technology so that at the end of that procedure, I have a proof from that video, that CT scan video, that, okay, things are balanced. And I'd feel better about that when someone's in temporaries and moving that on to definitives. I'd love to maybe sit with you again in 5 years, maybe over a beer, and say, you know what, I've been using it, and these are some other findings that I found. So I'm excited to try this technology. But you know, I think there's no doubt about it. Precision, which one of our patients don't deserve our precision? I think they all do, and they deserve our best hands. And nowadays, with everything going digital, obviously been around for 37 years, tech scan. It's not like it's new technology, but I think it's a time now, definitely more than ever, where we need to use all the tools we can to level up our game. And I think that's what T-Scan offers in terms of the occlusion realms. So my last question is, why are some of these, I mean, I've been on, you were there when I told you, I've been on so many occlusion courses, like I'm a massive junkie. Why didn't anyone else rave on about the importance of getting it right and being able, just being able to measure using a tech scan? It was seldom mentioned.
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not sure I have the correct answer for, or a single answer, but I think that the answer that I tend to believe is at the core of it is that, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, the T-scan has disproved all the principles of the different philosophies over and over and over again in science, validated science. And so their lack of adoption by some of the dentists throughout the world has been that it's challenged what they've been learning and teaching for some time now. An example would be, that you need to be in the right position to control the patient's symptoms. And of course, we treat people in MIP. We don't have to move them. We don't need appliance therapy for many of them. We can treat them right in their MIP. That's a disproving a positional belief system, right? And then there are many of those. There are at least three major positional belief systems, and for many people, the positions don't solve their solution, don't solve their problem. Just fixing their MIP solves their problem. And again, this is something that's been studied. Another example of what the T-scan has disproved many, many times over is the carbon paper marks. They don't measure anything, and choosing them. Another thing that the T-scan has disproved is that dentists can't choose the right marks with any accuracy. 3 separate studies on 600 to 700 dentists show that dentists will choose the wrong paper marks 85 to 95% of the time. And so there's a lot of things the T-scan has challenged, and disruptive technologies are often held back from adoption because they make people uncomfortable to face the realities of what they've learned may not actually be correct. And again, we have research, many, many, many studies to back up these philosophical, let's say, challenges that the T-scan offers dentistry, and all of it is a betterment for the patient, right? It's not that, if you can treat someone's, let's say, taking positions as a entity that is typically how TMJ is treated in some new position with some appliance-based location. Well, for the patient, imagine if you can not make an appliance and you don't need to change their position, and you treat their occlusion in precise, specific ways that you have to learn how to do to be a T-scan user, which I think I'll talk about in a second before we sign off. Mm-hmm. And the symptoms go away, most of them go away in 7 to 90 days, which matches up to 30 or 40 studies, which show that same thing over and over and over again in different populations and different classes of individuals and different practitioners doing the same kind of treatment, sort of replicating each other's findings. And you're a patient who can get rid of most of their symptoms in 2 to 3 months versus wearing an appliance for 18 months to 2 years, then maybe getting rid of their symptoms, maybe not getting rid of their symptoms, and then having to go through orthodontics to put their teeth together in the new position, or prosthodontics to put their teeth together in the new position, which is very costly and time consuming, when the T-scan could treat that same patient possibly, or a dentist using the T-scan in specific ways could possibly treat that patient in their MIP in 30 to 90 days, right? The value to the public is huge, and the value to the dentist is predictable outcomes that have been validated in many research studies. So The last thing I wanted to say was, you said,
Yes, please.
what if I'm in 5 years, we're having a beer and we were telling me, you have had great experiences and you found some new things. Well, I would certainly encourage that because, for example, you mentioned doing sleep studies. I've hoped to do a sleep study because we have many studies which show that people stop grinding their teeth. So a sleep study would be a perfect, extension of that. But the secret to being able to be effective with the T-scan is not owning one. It's being trained to use it well. And so one of the challenges the T-scan has had is people, take it out of the box and they try to use it. And even though they might get some introductory training, there are actually many skills one has to develop to be an effective T-scan user. And they all start out with recording in specific ways and setting up recording parameters to capture useful data. And that then translates into data analysis that allows one to intelligently assess the occlusion and the excursive function and the balance and the timing and the things that matter to the patient's neurophysiology. And the third level of training is to actually take that information to the patient's mouth and make intelligent adjustments that control many of these problems that traditional occlusion has no answers for. So without the training, just owning one won't do it. So if you train intensely, meaning you or a dentist who chooses to become involved with the T-scan, they have to train intensely to get good at it. It doesn't work by itself. The user makes it work well. And that's skill development that we teach you that you have to then practice and evolve. And once you do that and it becomes second nature, your patients will greatly thank you because you'll speed up many procedures, you'll control end results, you'll have longer lasting dental restorations, you'll be able to predictably treat patient after patient. And it isn't to say that just because you have a T-scan, there aren't people that come back and need touch-up bite adjustment visits. But the fascinating thing about that is as a prosthodontist, I delivered many, many, many cases, all different types of things from implant cases to crown and bridge cases to denture cases, combinations of all of them, partial denture cases. The numbers of people that came back for problematic occlusal adjustments in my practice from work that I did with the T-scan was so little compared to those that sought me out from all over the world who had routine dentistry done that they couldn't live with, sometimes for years. I got an email from one woman just to show you how impactful this problem is. A woman said, I had my bite adjusted, after some fillings, and I got TMJ. This is to paraphrase, and I was 25 at the time. Since that time, many procedures have been done trying to help me, and I'm not sure if the T-scan can help me, but I'm reaching out to you to find out. I'm now 67 years old. The woman went for 40 years with a post-operative dental scenario that was a routine procedure that translated into over 40 years of jaw problems, right? So any dentist can have a problem like that arise. And so the nature of the T-scan, it allows you to, once you learn how to use it well, to predictably obtain outcomes case after case. And that, of course, is a benefit to your patients, and it's certainly a benefit to the dental practice.
Well, Robert, I appreciate you giving your time to share about all your experiences that you've had and the good work you do in the teaching side of it. And I'm excited to use this technology to benefit my patients. Ultimately, everything I do is about my patients. And also, because I'm a big geek and I like my toys. So having an inclusion toy was really important to me. So I'm really excited to use it. If you don't mind, of course, I'll email you, get your advice. And I'd love to share some cases with you so I can get some mentorship and grow, because I appreciate the fact that, I've got Riaz in the UK who's obviously learning as well and using it. I've got other great clinicians, but to be able to stand on the shoulders of giants, to be able to accelerate how fast I can learn will be so important rather than just guessing. So I appreciate you so much for sharing what you have with the listeners today. And let's see where this journey takes me. And I think it's very, I'm sure it's been very fascinating to a lot of people to hear about some of the benefits they talked about. A lot of people will be like, well, this is all hocus pocus, whatever. And there are some dentists who will think that, but my philosophy is, listen to everyone, give your ears to everyone, all the different camps, and then be a student forever and be willing to appreciate others' perspectives. So thanks for sharing your perspective today and giving up your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I just want to state that the opinions that I expressed are mine and not those of TechScan, the corporation. And You're going to have great help in the UK from people like Riaz and Clark Dental and Ash Palmer. They're really taken to the T-scan. But I think the fact that you mentioned that you're open to many camps, you want to blend it all together. Just for everyone who's listening to understand, the T-scan crosses all camps. You can use the T-scan no matter what your philosophy is. If you want to do neuromuscular dentistry and open the mandible and advance the mandible and crown all the teeth and put it all together, you can use the T-scan on the orthotic phase. You can use the T-scan on the crown and bridge phase. You can use the T-scan on the temporary phase. The T-scan is universal in that way. It's not philosophical.
And also you can use the T-scan on the splints, and as well next year I'll be getting the EMG data for my splints as well to use it alongside the T-scan. So I'm quite excited to do that as well. So yeah, you can be used as a tool for those phases as well.
Yes, well, a splint is a really good example of something that, you can make a splint where the balance on the splint and the occlusal contact pattern is, again, 70% right, 30% left. That 70% side is not going to be tolerated well by the TM joint of that side. And so the effectiveness of the splint is then compromised. But with the articulating paper marks or the silicone imprints or whatever people are using to assess the splint quality, occlusal quality, there's no assessing. It's just ink spots. It's just holes in wax. It's not quantifiable information. So the T-scan will help you in anything that you make if you learn how to use it well. And that's really the important thing. Your training will make all the difference to you, Jazz. And so I look forward to helping you. And I'm certainly a resource for any T-scan user. You can email me, you can send me cases, and I often,
please do share your website so I can put it on the show notes. So those who want to learn more, especially I do have a lot of listeners in the US as well who maybe just want to for you to come back to the office as you suggested at the Congress, or in around the world who want your help and guidance as someone who's extremely experienced, like I wouldn't say founding member, but you were there with the chap who made it, and you've been using it the longest, more than anyone, I guess. So to have your expertise, I'd love to share your website and email so people can grow and learn from you.
Well, I can certainly give you that information, and if you want any research papers that we've done, I can certainly provide those to you as well. So, and which you can share with the podcast if you have requests for certain things.
Oh, we love papers. Honestly, my group of listeners, we all we do is before we sleep we read papers. Well, if you can send anything over, I think it will be a great help to a lot of skeptics. I mean, it's good to be a skeptic. It's good to reason. It's good to go by evidence. So, as soon as someone mentions new technology, there are people who willy-nilly will go for it. So, but it's always good. Like I questioned you a lot, obviously. It's good to question things, but it's also good to do your due diligence and read the papers and read the studies and not turn a blind eye to what's out there. So anything you can send, I'll be able to share with everyone. And again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. And I hope you enjoyed interviewing me.
I certainly did. Thank you so much. Well, there we have it, guys. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If you want to check out the evidence base, once again, it's protrusive.co.uk/evidence to download all the papers that Rob Kerstein has kindly shared with us all, so you can get an idea of the evidence base. I'm really enjoying my experience with T-scan so far. I think for multiple units, when I've got patient intemporaries, it gives me the confidence that things are balanced. I can even check something called the disclusion time. So when the patient is an MIP and they're excursing left and right, yes, we can talk about canine guidance and group function, etc. But one really important thing is that they should not be in that excursive motion for too long of a duration. You want it to be quick and smooth. And using the objective data of the T-scan allows me to do that. Now, I promised you in the intro that I'll talk to you in this outro about how I struck a business deal with my principals. So I think it was fair of me to say to my principals that, okay, I appreciate that I don't want you to get this for me because it's a big investment if you get it, and then if I'm the only one using it, is that really going to help you guys? So I said, okay, let me buy it, but then let me also get a bigger slice of the pie when I use it. So the way it works is that I knew that some dentists like Ash Palmer, I heard, would charge a subsidy. So here's your plan. It's X thousands of pounds of dollars, and you're going to do veneers and crowns and whatever. So I'm using it more and more for my bigger cases and also for evaluation. So I have two set fee prices. So if I know that for a case, I want to do do a T-scan bite analysis, I will charge X amount, okay? So £150, okay? So I will charge X amount for a bite analysis. So if I'm just going to use the sensor and I'm going to use it on that patient and I'm going to get some data gathering, then patients are happy, as part of the, when they pay for a wax up or when they pay for planning stages, patients understand that, okay, before we proceed any further, I need to do these tests. And once they see the technology, they're like, wow, okay, this is pretty cool. It's a great visual thing to show patients, and patients actually, really understand that the bite should be balanced. Patients often get that in a bite, there should be some degree of balance. Now, obviously, the background that I come from is occlusion versus occluding, very much inspired by Barry Glassman, and we can definitely talk about that in the occlusal adjustment that I'll be doing following this. But essentially, I have a price for bite analysis, but then the price I have for a T-scan-led bite adjustment. So basically, if I'm doing a bigger case, let's say I'm doing, like recently I had 4 crowns anteriorly and a chrome denture, and therefore at the end of that plan, I'm going to put in a T-scan sort of bite adjustment, and I will charge 2x or £300 as an extra. But anything I charge based on the T-scan, it would come to me as the associate 100% basically. So I still respect the time, the surgery time, and I still bill according to the surgery time, but as an addition, I would charge this sort of a subsidy for the T-scan, and that comes to me. And therefore, it's like a return on investment for this investment of a T-scan, and it also doesn't take anything away from the clinic. And if anything, it adds like a USP. It adds something unique to the clinic, and I do see myself getting more referrals in the future for this kind of stuff. So that's how I do it. That's how I agree. So kudos to my principals for agreeing to that. Thank you so much, John and Chris. I appreciate that. And I think it's a win-win for us both. I get a return on investment for the investment that I made as 100%, but we also get more patients, hopefully, and I get to do the kind of dentistry that I love, okay? I think all principals want a happy associate, and I'm very happy with my T-scan mounted on the wall, so I think this is a win-win. Hope you gained value from that, and I'll catch you in the occlusal adjustment and so many awesome episodes yet to come with great guests, so I look forward to sharing that with you all. I'll catch you in the next episode, same time, same place.